So it's almost the opposite of, or it's actually like when you're in your car, you plug something into your cigarette lighter. You can't just plug, your laptop power supply in there. You can't plug your blow dryer in there. You have to have that big box. They call it an inverter in your car, right? And it's sort of rated. Similar with the L-wire. Your battery doesn't go in there directly. You need sort of the box that's actually pulsing that frequency. You actually hear it when you turn it on because they tend to be fairly cheap. And so it's sort of tricky when you're stripping the L-wire. You don't necessarily want to cut the plastic. Because then you're actually going to start abrading these little magnet wires, and they're just teeny tiny. And so what I'm actually doing is I grab the plastic and I try to just pull it.
I see.
So I'm actually trying to just pull it off like that instead of
because you don't want to cut the.
So you see how easy I did that? Actually, it's way more difficult in reality.
When they light up, is it just like they straight light up, or like dances, like?
I guess we should try to plug one in here.
Ooh, good idea.
I mean, it might need
Nice.
some batteries from behind us. I think these are probably wired up. Let's see what's wrong. So the drivers, right? They come in all shapes and sizes. This is probably a very small one, easily wearable. This one you can probably light up to maybe like 3 or 4 feet. If you go much longer than that, it starts getting dimmer.
Okay.
Right, and so you get bigger drivers that take more power as you're getting more on the wire. And the other important thing to note is the driver, whenever it's powered, it always has to be hooked to the EL wire or you'll burn the driver out.
Oh.
Yeah, it's interesting, huh? And basically it's because they make them really, really cheap out of cheap components, and so it heats up if it doesn't have a load. So all the power it's generating is trying to basically push through
But
the
there's a
EL wire.
switch.
If you don't have the EL wire to sort of absorb all that, it actually just burns itself up.
So.
You find the battery.
Wow. So you never turn it on unless you've got it
unless it's
connected to the wire. Wow.
Which is kind of lame because generally you actually put your connectors in the wrong place. You put your connectors here, and so if you were to disconnect it while it's on, you can burn out your wire.
Oh,
The reason is because EO wire tends to be somewhat fragile. You put your connectors there so you can swap out wire and experiment with different drivers. Or if your driver burns out, you might want to sort of.
How much potential is there for flame?
Excuse me.
None. Yeah, the components are when they what they call fail safe. When it burns out, it breaks the connection instead of shorting the connection. And so here's a little one. You kind of see. So yeah, applications in daylight, not so useful.
Can we turn it off?
Yeah, of course.
Ah, nice.
At nighttime it works nice. It also tends to be blacklight reactive, so even if it breaks, it can be a nice accent.
And so, are there only 2 places to put things in the connector? So this connector that you added on here?
And because it's an alternating current, it actually doesn't matter. I can hook it up one way or I can hook it up the opposite way. And I only have to hook it up to one side. So just like the bulbs in your fluorescent lights, you only actually have to power them from one side. So
Neat.
Have you played with
This is easy. A lot of times if you're buying connectors, the geometry, because it's tricky to actually strip it consistently without roughing up these small wires, sometimes when you get the connectors, they actually are already sort of shaped with a particular geometry in mind, right? So this is maybe 3/4 of an inch, but when I stripped it. So I tend to actually modify these dimensions because what I want is this laying perfectly flat like that. And so the way I strip it, this will kind of make sense as I get into this a little deeper. But the theory is that at this point, instead of trying to strip it to the correct dimensions, I'm going to change the connector to the correct dimensions. Because the connector is way easier to work with than the wire. As soon as you get a clean strip that's over about a ½ inch, you run with it.
Yeah.
And so what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to get the tip of this to overlap a little bit with the shorter of the wires. And then so I'm just going to hold this right here. And then I actually want this other part, I want the insulation to basically be exactly where my strip mark is, right? And so I'm actually going to alter this now. And so you see how that lines up? And so assuming that I'm soldering sort of this tip together, I get sort of that insulation to overlap just ever so slightly right there, right?
Okay.
And then I'm actually going to take a little bit off this, and then I'm going to tin the end really good. And so tinning, if you haven't soldered before, it just means to sort of apply solder to your sort of connections before you solder everything together. And so we're actually going to do this one without heat shrink, just to kind of get through the basic techniques, and then we'll probably get into it. And so this last one you can usually strip off, and I usually actually try to hit it with a lighter, because the adhesive they use to keep the phosphor on that core wire tends to sort of resist solder a little bit, so you end up either having to overheat it or add a lot of flux. So sometimes I'll hit that with a lighter really quick, and it'll actually just like burn off whatever the adhesive they've used. Oh, perfect, thank you.
And someone has one.
Yeah, they're sort of around.
I'll have to go get one.
And then sometimes I'll just like wipe that off. And so I mean, and then this can actually be a tricky part, just to get solder to stick to this one part, and that's because of sort of that cleanliness of it. And ultimately, flux is used to kind of remove all of the air and other debris, and it is sort of a cleaning agent. And then so literally I will like add solder, and I'm not trying to be sparing at all until it's really well applied to that part. It's okay? And so now, because you guys haven't tried this before, you don't know, but what most people try to do is they try to tin these little wires, which is more or less impossible. So at this point I've tinned these 3 connections, right? The one core wire and then my connector. So now I just hook up this one. And so again, this is where I sort of use the hands-free soldering iron here, because I can sort of add more solder, and I can be more dexterous with the wires than I am with the soldering iron. And I sort of just like hold them together, and I usually just pull it off. Probably having a hard time because I'm talking. Just hold them together. Sometimes you blow on it, and then you want to test it. Like actually make sure.
You actually do that. Wow.
Actually do that, because you want it to break right now.
Right.
Because as soon as I start sewing this in,
It's like a pain in the butt.
right,
Yeah.
I've already sunk a lot of time into it. Right now, if it fails now, that's great. And so you go after it again. Then you sort of check it to make sure it doesn't have any pointy things. Sometimes as you're like whisking it off, it'll create a little point. If it did, I would sort of chip that off. Okay, so I've got one really good connection. So,
Hey, could you guys maybe just move back a little bit?
Oh, I'm
so that
sorry.
everyone can see?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I will probably go through this a few times. And then I take this part and I bend it up at almost a right angle, not even that far. And then I take these little wires and I wrap sort of one around. And a half a turn, a full turn, it's more than enough. I sort of just wrap one around one way, and I try to wrap one around the other way. If you do them both the same way, it's fine. But ultimately what I'm creating is I'm creating a lot of surface area, right? I'm basically making like this little net, almost, wrapped around it. And that's what solder is just going to like wick into really quickly, right? So I'm not actually trying to get necessarily the solder to stick to those little magnet wires, I just create sort of this whole thing, right? And that makes it really easy.
Nice.
But the magnet wires are connected to the other side of the circuit?
So I've got one edge of the connector going to the magnet wires, which is again it's that outside double helix that goes all the way around, and then I've got one end of the connector to the center one.
Is there one that should go on one particular
Doesn't
part
matter.
of the connector is reversible?
Right. So just sort of like your plug doesn't actually matter which way it goes in.
Okay.
And so ideally this should light up. Does anybody have that piece that was working that we passed around? Sweet. So
Et voila!
So sort of like make sure. So yeah, I mean again, it's like okay, I want to test it exactly now. I don't want to wait until. And so I make it look really easy, but literally like people will spend hours just trying to get that much of it running. Okay, so it's not working. So it could be any one of a couple things. My driver could be out. My batteries could be dead. My connections on sort of visual inspection look pretty good. Nothing is shorted. So the wire could actually be shorted anywhere along this line, right? We've been messing around with a lot. And so this is sort of where it gets into EOI repair. If I'm only powering from one side, I could try the end.
And then does the end have to be terminated? What happened?
The end was shorted.
So the end would actually.
Oh, I see. They were connected. Oh, somehow.
Right, and so and that's pretty common, right? Like the way I'm storing this. Like
Then
this
do you glue it or something after you're
this
done?
side's been rubbed, right? Like maybe I just shorted it there. So we got kind of lucky there. I mean, into like road repairs.
Sweet.
Like, if that didn't work, I probably would probably just start binary searching, like, or maybe I just do like an inch at a time. I would maybe I just cut it in the middle. Like,
Rip it all out and start over again.
Sometimes you could pull on it really tight, but generally, like again, if you're gonna actually like move on and put this into an art project, you want to make sure that it's so rugged at this point.
Sweet.
Can you solder two in together? Like
Yes,
say, like
absolutely.
opposite. Like say I solder the other side with another wire and solder,
Oh.
and then
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
braid
totally.
them together.
And same thing. I mean, basically, the way I would do that is I would actually use the magnet wires of one onto the core wire of another, and then the core wire of that one to the
Oh,
magnet
really?
wires of this one. You can do them
Oh,
end to
nice.
end.
Why do they call them magnet wires?
Magnet or corona wires. I don't know. I think I guess corona probably makes a little bit more sense because it's
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
under the
Around,
outside glow.
Huh.
And so it's, like they're trying to basically optimize for making
So
these
those
as
are the
small
wires
as
that are
possible.
glowing? The little thin ones? Oh,
There's
okay.
a phosphor coating on this. You can see it's sort of white right now. So I'm able to scrape off.
Oh, I see.
And
On
actually, if
on
you
the
look
big
at this one
wire.
while it's glowing, you can actually see the phosphor is glowing blue, and then I see wherever I've scratched that off, it's not glowing.
I see.
And
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
probably
see
even,
the
it's
blue
probably
right
even
there.
getting dimmer as it's getting closer to this connector because it no longer has those corona wires.
Right.
So I'm going to pass this around. But I would encourage you not to touch anything in this region because it is actually a fairly high voltage and it will give you an electric.
It is?
Yeah,
Yeah, it
it's
gives you a
something
little
like
bit of a buzz.
3 this degree again. And then I'll actually hit it with the lighter to just sort of melt. And what I'm melting is I'm melting this outer core, and there's usually also like another clear protective core in this sort of like wire. And so I'll literally like melt that, and then I'll pull the magnet wires back.
Oh, that's good.
And so what I'm actually using is I'm using this sheath to protect these wires. Because now, instead of it being like a fold or right angle, it's actually making a nice curve right, through this part. Right? And so then now I know they're sort of protected at the end and they're away from shorting anything on this point. And at that point, I'll literally like clip them off there. And then at this stage, it kind of depends on how clean I want the edge to be. If you look at sort of the unicorn horn that I was lighting up the edge, I actually didn't do anything because I wanted to sort of minimize what the visual impact of this part was. If this was going to be able, if this was in a jacket or something, I'd be able to sort of like hide it in a seam. What I would actually do is I would hit this with a hot glue gun and I would put heat shrink on it. And I would like shrink that down, and then I would sort of reclip to about there, and then I'd sort of have this, black.
Sweet. Well, this is so exciting. Really?
Is there a limitation of the voltage? Or like with higher voltage, is it going to be brighter?
That's a really, really good question. There is sort of like a max brightness for most of these. And I think you actually end up finding kind of a sweet spot where you end up buying the drivers and their amount of power. It's usually rated for a length of wire.
Okay.
And so if you go much above that, you can go longer lengths, but then you're like diminishing the brightness. But as long as you're sort of in that sweet spot, you're actually going to get about as bright as it's going to get.
So exciting.
And so, like,
Are you excited? You're gonna, like, run out and buy a whole bunch?
Me
Me too. I am too.
And so I usually, like, anytime I grab a driver, the first thing I do is I write on it, like, okay, these are AA batteries and it's 1 to 18 feet. And so, like, yes, I could go a half a foot, but I'm probably using way more power than I need and way more batteries than I need, right? And so it's like I would run this because of the manual effort I went through.
Cool
But,
neon.
I mean, it's
Why are you working on
this is another piece of EO wire. It just happens to have a colorful sheath.
A colorable sheet, okay. I've never seen it before.
Yeah.
So it actually...
They actually have some EL sequencer shield, or they call one like an EL escondido or something.
Yeah, and then you
EL
have you need
sequencer
an Arduino
shield.
with
EL
it as well.
escondido.
But then you can program it to do whatever you want, and you can use sensors, which is cool, or you can just program it to do patterns.
Yeah, and I mean these audio sensors actually run the heat shrink all the way through. Otherwise, I'd have to sort of do that first. It's always easy to forget the heat shrink. So I sort of do a test fit, and I figure out kind of which direction it slides on more easily. So it's going to slide on this
I
way.
see.
Because here timing becomes a little bit of an issue. I'm literally like, okay, I get just
Yeah, once you add the
Just-
glue.
not even very much.
Yeah, because it could obstruct.
Get it to cover everything. Usually kind of rotate a little bit. And now, and I kind of make sure that my wire and my geometry so it's still pretty smooth. And
I think when you do it, you probably want to do it with a slightly longer wire than you really need, just in case.
there we go.
Well, that's the other thing too. You want slack in this stuff, right? If you're making it for your body,
Oh,
because your
true.
body is always in motion, so you really do want a little bit of
Yeah,
slack and everything,
yeah.
and not making it tight.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because you're always gonna be tugging on it.
That's how you
And
heat
so-
shrink it?
Well, I'd use a gun, but probably somewhere. I don't. And I mean, it's sort of like I like having. Again, it's like the reason I use the copper tape. Like I like having the most minimalistic kit, where it's like, okay, all I really need is a knife and this, and It's for road repairs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I like using the clear, and I go sort of out of my way to get the clear, just because then like you can actually do the visual
clear.
inspection afterwards when stuff
Yeah.
breaks. You can like, look at, well, was that it?
Okay,
and I'll start cutting from the
that's a
end.
good tip.
Oh, looks glowy. So,
Yeah, I see it.
Again, it's because
Lights
sort of
off,
this
lights
color is a little darker, so it's going to be less bright.
Lights
than
off.
that one, right?
Ooh, cute. So pretty.
So, questions? Okay, so we got some sensors on the belt. If I were to do this, is sort of hastily done, so I might have run the wires a little different. I'm going to use something different. Then, here we have. So the only reason I really put this in the box is because the EL wire, well, again, it will electrocute you, right? And so I made a little box, and so this is an EL wire driving. This is an EL wire switching Arduino. This is the one off SparkFun, the Esquandino. I taped it up. But
Oh, I
you gotta
think that's
see.
pretty good.
Okay, so here's where all the EL wire is coming off, all 8 strips. And then on this side I've got one connector for the battery and 2 for the driver. So I got the power coming in, the power coming out. The reason I put the driver outside the box is they can overheat. So I actually blew out a driver once. And then here's where I have my sensors going in. I've got a programming header here, so I hook this to the computer, to the little USB ports. And so I add code, just basically saying, oh, like read these pins, and the code is relatively simple, right? It's basically reading a value here, and then adding it together, and dividing it by something, and then it's just sort of literally going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Nice.
Like, if I wanted to put like the EL sequencer, like the shield, I would have something like that, like
Yeah.
Arduino.
The
and
shield is basically this exact thing, it just fits on top of the other one.
so it'll like say like it's compatible with whatever Arduino, and then you can just
Yeah, well, anytime we say shield, it means it's pretty much made for the
because I mean they have like the lily pad, like it's round, and then so they'll tell you like